The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. as the FBI special agent adjusted his position in the driver's seat of his weathered gray sedan. The night air was thick with humidity, typical for a summer evening in suburban Atlanta. He'd been sitting there for almost 2 hours now, his dark blue jacket discarded in the backseat, his collar slightly loose, just enough to stay comfortable while maintaining the appearance he'd carefully crafted over the past 6 months. The street was quiet, lined with closed shops and flickering streetlights. Only the occasional passing car broke the silence. From his position, he had a clear view of the abandoned convenience store that served as tonight's meeting point. His fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, not from nervousness, but from the anticipation of knowing how close he was to bringing down one of the biggest drug operations in the state. 6 months of undercover work had led to this moment. 6 months of building trust, of carefully navigating the dangerous waters between maintaining his cover and gathering evidence. He'd started small, making connections at local bars, slowly working his way up through the ranks of street-level dealers until he finally caught the attention of the bigger players. His phone buzzed softly. A text message from his handler. Status check. He typed back a quick all clear before slipping the phone back into his pocket. The weight of his backup weapon pressed against his ankle, a constant reminder of the risks involved in this line of work. His main service weapon was hidden under the seat, too risky to carry it openly in his current role. Through the windshield, he watched as a stray cat darted across the empty parking lot, disappearing into the shadows. The scene reminded him of his own role, always present but never drawing attention, moving through the criminal underworld like a ghost while piecing together the puzzle of this trafficking operation. Tonight's meeting wasn't just another exchange. After months of careful work, he was finally going to meet one of the key distributors. The intelligence suggested this person was the link between the street-level operations and the main supplier. Getting close enough to identify them would be a major breakthrough. His mind wandered to the evidence locker back at the bureau, where recordings and documentation from countless meetings were safely stored. Each piece was a small part of a larger picture, carefully collected and catalogued. The operation had already led to the identification of several corrupt business fronts, money laundering schemes, and a network of distributors that spread across 3 states. The agent checked his watch again. The meeting was set for midnight. In the distance, he could see the first signs of his contact arriving, headlights turning onto the street, moving slowly and deliberately. His heart rate picked up slightly, but his breathing remained steady. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. As he waited, he ran through his cover story one more time. Every detail had to be perfect. In this world, one small slip could mean the difference between success and failure, or worse. He'd spent countless hours developing his backstory, making it detailed enough to be believable, but simple enough to maintain under pressure. He thought about his team, positioned discreetly in various locations nearby, ready to move if things went wrong. They were his lifeline, though he knew they couldn't break his cover unless his life was in immediate danger. Too much was at stake: months of work, countless resources, and the chance to stop a drug operation that had destroyed countless lives. The approaching car was getting closer now. Its headlights cut through the darkness, creating long shadows across the empty parking lot. The agent took one final deep breath, settling into the character he'd lived with for half a year. Everything was in place. The evidence-gathering devices were active, his backup was in position, and years of training had prepared him for this moment. What he didn't know was that fate had other plans for tonight. In just a few minutes, everything would change, and this carefully planned operation would take a turn that nobody could have anticipated. The red and blue lights suddenly filled his rearview mirror, shattering the careful calm of the stakeout. The FBI agent's heart sank as he watched his months of undercover work potentially unraveling in an instant. The patrol car had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, its lights piercing through the quiet darkness of the suburban street. He remained perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel. A habit born from both his law enforcement training and his awareness of the reality of traffic stops for black men in America. Through his side mirror, he could see the local officer approaching, flashlight beam dancing across the pavement. The agent took a slow, measured breath, keeping his undercover persona firmly in place despite the growing tension in his chest. The approaching footsteps were deliberate, heavy, boots on asphalt, creating a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. The agent's mind raced through his options. His cover identity was solid, backed by carefully crafted documentation that could withstand routine scrutiny. But any prolonged interaction with local law enforcement risked exposing the operation, putting months of work and countless resources in jeopardy. The flashlight beam swept across his side mirror, then through his back window, before settling on his face. He squinted slightly against the harsh light, but maintained his composed demeanor. His FBI-issued body camera was already running, activated by a subtle movement the moment the patrol car's lights had appeared. The small device, disguised as a button on his shirt, captured everything that was about to unfold. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone carrying an edge that the agent immediately recognized as trouble. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop, just an immediate assertion of authority. The agent kept his movements slow and telegraphed, narrating his actions in a calm, clear voice. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket, sir." As he handed over his undercover license, he noticed a second patrol car pulling up quietly behind the first. The situation was escalating before any real interaction had even begun. The agent's training kicked in, his mind documenting every detail while maintaining his outward calm. He noted badge numbers, car numbers, and the fact that neither officer had activated their body cameras, a violation of department policy. The first officer studied the license with exaggerated scrutiny, shining his flashlight on it from different angles. "What are you doing out here this time of night?" The question came with an accusatory tone that made it clear this wasn't a routine traffic stop. The agent provided his practiced response about heading home from a late shift at work, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. The second officer had taken up position on the passenger side now, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. The agent caught this detail in his peripheral vision while keeping his primary focus on the first officer. The air grew thicker with tension as the first officer began questioning inconsistencies he claimed to see in the license, inconsistencies the agent knew didn't exist. Through the windshield, he could see his target's car making a U-turn at the far end of the street, abandoning the planned meeting. 6 months of careful work was slipping away with each passing second, but that was now the least of his concerns. The situation was taking on a familiar pattern, one he'd seen too many times, both as a law enforcement officer and as a black man in America. More questions followed, each one more aggressive than the last. Where was he coming from? Where was he going? Did he have any weapons in the car? Did he have anything he shouldn't have? The agent answered each one calmly and clearly, knowing that both his body camera and likely several nearby security cameras were recording everything. The first officer's radio crackled with a response to his license check. The agent knew his cover identity would come back clean. It had been meticulously crafted by the FBI's best. But something in the officer's demeanor changed, his suspicion seeming to grow rather than diminish with the confirmation. He stepped back slightly, his hand moving to rest on his weapon as well. Nearby, a few late-night workers from the surrounding businesses had started to notice the scene. Some had pulled out their phones, recording from a safe distance. The agent was acutely aware of how quickly things could spiral out of control. His training as both an FBI agent and an undercover operative warred with his survival instincts and years of personal experience. The next few moments would require perfect balance, maintaining his cover while ensuring his safety, all without escalating a situation that was already teetering on the edge. As the first officer returned to his window, the agent could feel the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just about a blown operation anymore. This was about something much more fundamental and much more dangerous. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as the situation began to unravel. The FBI agent could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool night air conditioning in his car. His ears picked up the sound of more sirens in the distance, backup that nobody had called for, yet somehow seemed to be arriving anyway. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer commanded, his voice carrying a tone that made it clear this wasn't a request. The agent's mind raced through his options. As an FBI agent, he had the authority to identify himself, but doing so would destroy months of careful undercover work and potentially put other agents in danger. As a black man facing an increasingly hostile police encounter, he knew his choices were limited and loaded with risk. He kept his movements deliberately slow and visible as he unbuckled his seatbelt. "Yes, sir," he responded, maintaining a calm that came from years of training and experience. Through his mirrors, he could see at least 3 more patrol cars pulling up, their lights casting an overwhelming red and blue glow across the entire street. The small crowd of onlookers had grown. The agent counted at least 7 people holding up phones, recording everything. In another situation, this might have been reassuring, having witnesses and documentation. But right now, it only added to the complexity of maintaining his cover while ensuring his safety. As he stepped out of the car, following every instruction to the letter, he noticed how the first officer's partner had moved to a tactical position. It was the kind of positioning taught at police academies for high-risk stops, except there was no justification for treating this as high risk. He recognized all the signs of a situation being manipulated to justify escalating force. "Put your hands where I can see them." The command came from multiple officers now, even though his hands had been clearly visible the entire time. The agent complied, keeping his movements steady and predictable. His FBI training had taught him how to control high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't about maintaining control, it was about maintaining survival while protecting an operation that could save countless lives. The cool night air carried the sounds of radio chatter, the murmuring crowd, and the hum of idling police engines. A helicopter's spotlight suddenly swept across the scene, adding to the chaos of flashing lights. The agent wondered briefly if it was news or police aviation. Either way, this situation was getting more attention than any undercover operative would want. "He matches the description of a suspect in a recent robbery," one officer said to another, just loud enough for the agent to hear. His heart sank. He knew this tactic well. It was a common excuse used to justify unnecessary stops and searches, often with no actual robbery or suspect description to back it up. More commands followed, each one delivered with increasing aggression despite his perfect compliance. The agent's mind flashed to the sealed compartment in his car containing his FBI credentials. Those documents could end this immediately, but they would also end the operation that had targeted a drug network responsible for dozens of deaths in the community. The growing crowd of witnesses had begun to shout protests at the officer's behavior. Some were streaming live on their phones, providing real-time documentation of what was unfolding. The agent could hear their angry voices mixing with the officer's commands, creating a backdrop of tension that threatened to spark into something worse. He watched his months of careful work dissolving in real time. The target location was now dark and empty. Word of police activity would have scattered anyone connected to the operation. Worse, if his cover was blown here, it could compromise other ongoing investigations and put other undercover agents at risk. The first officer was now demanding he turn around and put his hands behind his back. The agent complied, his mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. He could feel the presence of multiple officers around him, that anxious energy making an already dangerous situation even more volatile. In his law enforcement career, he'd been on both sides of similar situations, but never quite like this. As an FBI agent, he conducted high-risk arrests. As a black man, he'd faced unjustified stops. But tonight, these two realities were colliding in a way that threatened both his safety and a major federal investigation. Time seemed to stretch as he waited for the cold touch of handcuffs, knowing that the next few moments would force him to make an impossible choice. Either way, nothing about this night would end the way anyone had planned. The only question was how much damage would be done before it was over. The growing crowd of witnesses had begun to shout protests at the officer's behavior. Some were streaming live on their phones, providing real-time documentation of what was unfolding. The agent could hear their angry voices mixing with the officer's commands, creating a backdrop of tension that threatened to spark into something worse. He watched his months of careful work dissolving in real time. The target location was now dark and empty. Word of police activity would have scattered anyone connected to the operation. Worse, if his cover was blown here, it could compromise other ongoing investigations and put other undercover agents at risk. The first officer was now demanding he turn around and put his hands behind his back. The agent complied, his mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. He could feel the presence of multiple officers around him, that anxious energy making an already dangerous situation even more volatile. In his law enforcement career, he'd been on both sides of similar situations, but never quite like this. As an FBI agent, he conducted high-risk arrests. As a black man, he'd faced unjustified stops. But tonight, these two realities were colliding in a way that threatened both his safety and a major federal investigation. Time seemed to stretch as he waited for the cold touch of handcuffs, knowing that the next few moments would force him to make an impossible choice. Either way, nothing about this night would end the way anyone had planned. The only question was how much damage would be done before it was over. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around the FBI agent's wrists, each notch tightening like the grip of the impossible situation he found himself in. The night air had grown colder, or maybe it was just the adrenaline coursing through his body, making him more aware of every sensation. The red and blue lights continued their relentless dance across the scene, casting strange shadows on the growing crowd of witnesses. "The vehicle needs to be searched," one officer announced, already moving toward the car. The agent knew what was inside. His sealed FBI credentials, his service weapon secured under the seat, and enough evidence from his undercover operation to blow his cover sky high. His mind raced through scenarios, calculating risks and consequences with each passing second. "I do not consent to any searches," he stated firmly but calmly, remembering that his hidden body camera was still recording everything. The first officer scoffed at this, making a comment about how people who have nothing to hide don't refuse searches. The agent had used similar lines himself during his early days in law enforcement, before experience and training had taught him better. The crowd of onlookers had swelled to at least 30 people now. Their phones glowed in the darkness like fireflies, capturing every moment. Some were narrating what they saw, their voices carrying across the parking lot. "He didn't do anything. They just pulled him over. He's been completely cooperative." The agent could hear the anger and frustration in their voices, a chorus of two familiar stories playing out once again. "What's this?" Another officer's voice cut through the night. He had opened the car door despite the agent's clear refusal for a search. The agent watched as the officer's flashlight beam swept across the interior, knowing it was only a matter of time before they found something that would force his hand. Every second brought him closer to having to reveal his true identity. A young woman in the crowd stepped forward, her phone held high as she live-streamed. "I've been recording since the beginning," she announced loudly. "He did nothing wrong. This is harassment." Several others voiced their agreement, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing moment. The first officer turned toward the crowd, his hand resting on his weapon in what the agent recognized as an unconscious intimidation tactic. "Back up. This is an active crime scene." The agent noticed how quickly a routine traffic stop had been elevated to a crime scene without any actual crime being committed. That's when things took another turn. "Got something," came a shout from the car. The agent's heart sank. They'd found either his credentials or his weapon. There was no more time to weigh options. The next few moments would change everything, and he had to choose his words carefully. "Officers," he began, keeping his voice steady and professional despite the circumstances. "Before you go any further, there's something you need to know." But the first officer cut him off, his voice carrying a tone of triumph that made the agent's stomach turn. "Federal badge," the officer by the car announced, holding up the leather credential holder. "Looks fake to me." The agent could hear the shuffling of feet as officers moved into more defensive positions. He knew how this looked from their perspective, or at least how they would claim it looked in their reports. The young woman who'd been live streaming spoke up again. "He's trying to tell you something. Why won't you listen?" Her voice carried the frustration of countless similar scenes, played out on countless similar nights. The agent appreciated her advocacy but knew it was only adding fuel to an already volatile situation. "I am a federal agent," he stated clearly and firmly, loud enough for both the officers and the recording phones to pick up. "My credentials are genuine. You can verify this with your dispatch." But even as he spoke, he could see in their faces that they'd already decided not to believe him. The first officer moved closer, his face now illuminated by the patrol car's lights. "Impersonating a federal officer is a serious crime," he said, his voice carrying a threatening edge. "You're just making things worse for yourself." The agent noticed how the officer's body camera was still off, while phones continued to record from every angle. The night had become a perfect storm of everything that could go wrong: an undercover operation blown, racial profiling in progress, and now the very real possibility of being arrested for possessing his own legitimate credentials. The agent took a slow, deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would require every bit of training and experience he possessed. Through it all, his hidden body camera continued recording, documenting every word, every action, and every decision that had led to this moment. Whatever happened next would be preserved, not just on his device, but on dozens of phones held by concerned citizens who refused to look away from what they were witnessing. The precinct buzzed with unusual energy for that time of night. Officers who would normally be heading home after their shifts lingered around, drawn by whispered conversations about the arrest. The FBI agent sat calmly in the interview room, still handcuffed, watching the clock on the wall tick past 2 a.m. His years of training helped him maintain his composure even as he heard the growing commotion outside. The door burst open with such force that the young officer standing guard nearly jumped. In walked a woman in a crisp suit, her FBI badge already held high, her presence immediately commanding attention. The special agent in charge didn't waste a second on pleasantries. "Remove those handcuffs," she ordered, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Now." Behind her, the agent's supervisor appeared, carrying a thick folder of documentation. The local officers in the room stood frozen, the reality of the situation slowly dawning on their faces. The supervising officer, who had been so confident at the scene, now looked distinctly uncomfortable as he fumbled with the handcuff keys. "Would someone care to explain?" the special agent in charge continued, her controlled tone somehow more intimidating than if she had shouted, "Why one of our most successful undercover operatives is sitting in handcuffs." She held up her phone, showing the live stream that had already gathered over 50,000 views. The crowded room suddenly felt very small. The agent rubbed his wrists as the handcuffs came off, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the situation. His supervisor walked over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder while setting the folder on the table. Inside were copies of every document that proved the agent's identity and authority. 6 months of careful investigative work, the supervisor said, spreading out the paperwork. A major drug trafficking operation that spans 3 states. Dozens of potential arrests, all of it compromised tonight. He didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of the words was enough to make several officers shift uncomfortably. The precinct captain had arrived now, his face ashen as he watched the scene unfold. On a laptop someone had set up, they could see the incident from multiple angles, the agent's body camera footage playing alongside videos from witnesses' phones. The unprofessional comments, the unauthorized search, the ignored attempts to de-escalate, all of it documented in perfect clarity. "Your officer's body camera was off," the special agent in charge noted, pointing to a still image from one of the witness videos. "Department policy requires it to be activated during all stops. Would you like to explain that?" The captain had no answer, his eyes fixed on the screen where the evidence of misconduct played out in high definition. Outside the precinct, news vans had begun to arrive. The videos had spread across social media like wildfire, drawing attention from major news networks. The young woman who had been live streaming was being interviewed, her footage playing on screens across the country. The story was already taking shape in the public consciousness, an FBI agent racially profiled and arrested while working undercover. 3 days after the incident, the FBI agent sat in his apartment, watching news coverage of the event play out on multiple channels. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten as he scrolled through an endless stream of social media posts, news articles, and public reactions. The video of his arrest had reached over 10 million views, sparking intense discussions about law enforcement practices and racial profiling. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from fellow agents and colleagues. Some offered support, others shared similar experiences they'd kept quiet about for years. The most difficult messages came from his family, their fear and anger mixing with pride in how he'd handled the situation. His mother had called every day, her voice carrying the weight of years spent worrying about her son, both as a black man and as a law enforcement officer. The operation he'd spent 6 months building was in shambles. His team worked around the clock, executing emergency warrants at known locations before evidence could be destroyed. They'd managed to secure some arrests, but many key players had slipped away in the chaos following his detention. Each lost suspect represented countless hours of careful work, trust-building, and risk-taking, all undone in a single night. In his living room, files and reports covered every surface. He was working on multiple documents: his official statement about the incident, reports about the compromised operation, and detailed accounts of every interaction during the traffic stop. His body camera footage had been downloaded and secured, along with recordings from dozens of witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming, but that didn't make the process any easier. The local police department had placed the officers involved on administrative leave pending investigation. Their police chief had held a press conference, using careful language about reviewing procedures and taking appropriate action. The FBI agent watched these statements with a professional eye, noting how they focused on policies and procedures rather than addressing the underlying issues. His supervisor called around noon, updating him on the fallout. Internal Affairs was investigating the officers involved, but they were also looking into the department's broader pattern of traffic stops and racial profiling. The young woman who had live-streamed the incident had become an unexpected ally, her clear documentation and calm narration providing crucial context to the events. Community leaders had organized peaceful protests outside the police precinct, calling for accountability and reform. The FBI agent watched the coverage with mixed emotions. As a law enforcement officer, he understood the complexities of policing. As a black man who had just experienced profiling firsthand, he felt the protesters' frustration in his bones. His unique position, being both a federal agent and a victim of racial profiling, had sparked national conversations about systemic issues in law enforcement. Later that afternoon, he had a virtual meeting with the FBI's public relations team. They wanted him to make a public statement, seeing an opportunity to address important issues while maintaining the Bureau's integrity. He spent hours crafting his words carefully, knowing they would be scrutinized from all angles. He needed to be honest about what happened while not compromising ongoing investigations or damaging relationships between law enforcement agencies. The hardest part was dealing with the lost opportunities from his undercover operation. Each day brought new reports of drug-related incidents in the community, lives being lost to the very network he'd been so close to shutting down. The dealers had scattered, taking their operations even deeper underground. It would take months, maybe years, to rebuild the kind of intelligence they'd lost. His apartment buzzer rang, another delivery of case files from the Bureau. As he signed for them, his elderly neighbor stopped to talk. She'd seen him on the news and wanted to share her support. Her grandson had faced similar profiling, though with far worse outcomes. These conversations happened daily now, strangers sharing their stories, seeing in him a voice for their own experiences. The sun was setting as he reviewed surveillance photos from the operation, trying to salvage what leads they could. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. They wanted his input on new training protocols, seeing in his experience both the problem and potential solutions. Even as one operation ended, new opportunities for positive change were emerging. As night fell, he stood at his window, watching the city lights come alive. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more reports, more steps toward accountability. The incident had forced crucial conversations into the open, but real change would require more than just talk. His unique position, caught between two worlds, gave him a perspective that could help bridge the divide. The question was how to use that perspective to create meaningful, lasting change. 3 months had passed since that fateful night, and the FBI agent stood before a packed auditorium at the Law Enforcement Training Academy. The room was filled with a mix of veteran officers and fresh recruits, all eyes fixed on him as he shared his story. His presentation wasn't just about what went wrong that night, it was about how to make things right. The trafficking network had been dismantled, though not as thoroughly as originally planned. Quick action by his team in the days following his arrest had led to several key arrests. Some of the main players had escaped, but their operation was crippled. More importantly, the incident had sparked changes that went far beyond a single drug bust. The officer who had initiated the stop was facing departmental charges and civil rights violations. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar stops, leading to a broader review of department practices. But instead of just punishing individuals, the focus had shifted to preventing these incidents from happening in the first place. The FBI agent had received unexpected support from within law enforcement circles. Other officers, both black and white, had started sharing their own experiences and concerns. What began as a crisis had evolved into an opportunity for honest dialogue about race, power, and responsibility within law enforcement. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket, another message from the young woman who had live-streamed his arrest. She had become an unexpected partner in his work, helping bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Together, they had developed a program teaching citizens and officers about their rights and responsibilities during encounters. The presentation screen behind him showed statistics about the impact of their new initiatives. Traffic stop data was now publicly available, body camera compliance had reached nearly 100%, and complaints about racial profiling had decreased. Small changes, perhaps, but meaningful ones that were spreading to other departments across the country. In the front row sat his supervisor, who had supported him through everything. The Bureau had recognized the importance of his experience, promoting him to lead a new initiative focused on building trust between law enforcement agencies and minority communities. It wasn't the career path he had expected, but it felt right. During the question and answer session, a young recruit raised his hand. How do you balance being both a law enforcement officer and a member of a community that often fears us? The room grew quiet, everyone waiting for his response. The agent took a moment, remembering all the conversations he'd had with family, friends, and fellow officers over the past months. It's not about balance, he replied, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. It's about bringing these experiences together. Every traffic stop, every interaction, it's an opportunity to either build trust or break it. We'd have to understand both perspectives to do this job right. The young recruit nodded, writing something in his notebook. After the presentation, several officers stayed to talk. Some shared similar experiences, others asked for advice about situations they'd encountered. The conversations were different now, more open, more honest. People were finally talking about the uncomfortable realities of law enforcement and race in America. His next stop was a community center in the neighborhood where he'd been arrested. The same people who had recorded his arrest now worked with him to improve police-community relations. They had created a youth program where kids could meet officers in a positive setting, breaking down barriers of fear and mistrust on both sides. The drug operation that had been compromised wasn't forgotten. His team had adapted, finding new ways to target trafficking networks while maintaining better communication with local law enforcement. The incident had forced them to rethink their approaches, leading to improved coordination between agencies. As he drove home that evening, he passed the spot where it had all happened. The street looked different now, not just because of the passage of time, but because of how that night had changed things. The department had new leadership, new policies, and a new commitment to building trust with the community. His promotion ceremony was scheduled for next week. The position had been created specifically to address the issues his experience had highlighted. It wasn't just about preventing similar incidents, it was about transforming how law enforcement and communities interact. The changes wouldn't happen overnight, but they were happening. On his desk at home lay a draft of his new training program, along with letters from officers and citizens who had been impacted by his story. Each one represented a small step toward positive change. The incident that could have ended his career had instead opened new doors, creating opportunities for meaningful reform. As night fell, he reviewed his notes for tomorrow's community meeting. The work wasn't easy, and progress sometimes felt slow, but it was happening. His unique experience, though painful at the time, had created a bridge between two worlds that desperately needed to understand each other better. It wasn't the end he had expected for his undercover operation, but maybe it was the beginning of something even more important.